Marriage. Marriage is what brings us together. Love, true love. It's a blessed arrangement between two people. So I guess I'm not getting a mic this morning, so I'm using my orator Megan voice. Can y'all hear me in the back?
Yes.
Hey, if you can't hear me, just give me a whoop whoop, and I will turn up the volume.
Or squeeze in. There's lots of room.
Or squeeze in, yeah.
Most of us only bite if you ask nicely.
Not hard.
Wheel and beg pretty.
So the topic today is spirit marriage, cultivating a bonded relationship with otherworldly beings, or what I prefer the term is extraordinary beings, because otherworldly tends to kind of imply that they're not part of this world, and they very much are. So just a little bit about this topic, the history of this topic, and what spirit marriage is. Spirit marriage is the bonded relationship between a human and a subtle or discarnate entity, such as a deity, a spirit, an extraordinary intelligence, etc., etc., etc. In this practice, the consciousness of the practitioner is said to be linked or wedded to a specific entity, and the two beings share a co-creative consciousness forthwith. So how did I get to this topic? Or more accurately, how did this topic find me? In 2002, I began to experience dream encounters with a spirit contact who, after a few years, asked to marry me. Repeatedly, and with increasing insistence. These extraordinary dreams included visitations, prophecies, lucid consciousness, and other parapsychological phenomena. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and how it leads to the research that I did, and then I'll tell you what happened after the research with my story, and that's going to be the bulk. When I checked in with the spirits guiding this research, I asked, how do you want me to do this for a Pantheacon audience? Because I just gave a version of this lecture last year when I defended my PhD dissertation on this subject.
Which I watched the YouTube video.
Yeah, which you can watch on YouTube. I have a sign-up list here, so you can give me your email and I will send out that. It's 2 hours. It's very academic, so if you nerd out on that kind of stuff, you can watch that. This is going to be much more of an experiential narrative account of the practices, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So my story begins kind of at birth. I was raised in the Pentecostal Christian tradition, and when I was about a year old, I was diagnosed with a kidney defect, and I was resistant to antibiotics and all sorts of things, and they decided that they were going to need to do surgery on me, less than a year old, so tiny little baby. And my family, being a family of faith healers, brought the minister in, anointed my body with oil, and my mom, my aunts, the minister, the adults in the room laid hands on me and prayed the Holy Spirit fire into my body. So you can imagine being this tiny child with adults around you praying the Holy Spirit into it. Kind of blew me open. And so although the primary function of my spiritual practice growing up was in Pentecostalism, which, by the way, I consider to be the spirit worker practitioners of Christianity, right? What do Pentecostals do? They speak in tongues, which is a form of channeling. They lay on of hands, which is a form of energy healing. They dance in the spirit, which is possessory and trance-induced. So we were doing all of these things. I think they would be very uncomfortable to hear that we sort of consider them one of us, but they really are one of us. So that was sort of the water that I swam in growing up. But I found that I could just as easily step into those ecstatic states and those numinous states out in nature. And I found this really early on as a child, that being in trees and around trees, singing to trees and water, brought those spirits close to me as well. So I learned that it wasn't just this church, this boxed-in church, that was going to allow those kind of contacts. And as I matured and became sort of disillusioned with the dogma of Pentecostalism, I decided to study numinous and subtle forces. And I went to college and then to seminary and studied religion and spirituality, really all in an attempt to try and understand this ecstasis, this energy, which I would later identify as a Shakti or Wisdom Sophia, moving through me, that I could feel, but that was irrespective of any religion or any dogma. And so it was along that journey that I found paganism. Met my first pagan witch in seminary. Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is really like, and then I went and did most of my studies for the Center for Women's Spirituality at the Graduate Theological Union up in Berkeley. And so after those experiences in seminary, I began to, there was sort of my descent into the underworld, which is a whole initiation experience that I went through for about 7 years. And then I came out of that and began to practice yoga. And I remember that I was laying in Shavasana in corpse pose, and all of a sudden I felt this energy in my body that felt just like the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, but it was not in a church situation at all. And I remember seeing the painting by Alex Gray, Theologue, which is this being sitting on like a vast matrix plane, and there's these colors, that what I would discover are the chakras that were lit up, and that was what I was experiencing in my body. So I became sort of obsessed with understanding the somatic experience then. So I'd sort of done the intellectual part, and I wanted to understand the somatic experience. So I began to train as an energy healer and a holistic healing practitioner and a hypnotherapist, and like you name it, it was like studied as much Chinet song and Reiki and all of these various subtle body modalities. And it was around that time that I kind of identified as pagan light. I'd gone to some Pantheacons. I was really groovy with, the pagan ethos and identity, but I hadn't really found my teacher. And around that time is when my first spirit contact began in earnest. And I was living in this little cottage in San Francisco under this giant tree. And I had like a garden out around my little cottage. And I began to have these nighttime visitations of a spirit contact / spirit lover. And eventually this contact began to ask to marry me. And I had no clue. This was like 2002, 2003. I had no clue what was going on. I hadn't heard of this before. I hadn't seen this in any tradition. The only thing that I could remember was when I was in seminary, one of the seminary teachers talked about, he was one of those fabulous heresy scholars. And if you really understand what the word heresy means, it comes from the root it comes from the word hierotikos, able to choose. A heretic is someone who chooses, which I thought was super groovy. So he was talking about the Enochian or the Genesis account where the sons of God came down and saw the daughters of man as beautiful and took to them wives. And then in the apocryphal Enochian texts, they spawned the Nephilim. So these giants, these beings that are hybrids, half human, half angelic, and had wondrous powers and skills. For those of you that were at Tommy Starchild's talk last night, this is one of the ideas that is where the witch blood has come from, and he's exploring that in his book that will be out this year, next year, hopefully. So so that was my moment of like, okay, I remember this story. How am I going to find resources on this? So it was 2002. We had the internet back then, but it was limited. And so I just was like, okay, it's a spirit and it wants to marry me, spirit marriage. And I Googled, well, I didn't Google, but it must have been like Netscape Navigators. Yeah, right? So I searched spirit marriage, and the only significant contact I found was one Ida C. Craddock. So those of you that are Thelemites and understand who Ida Craddock is, she was a early 20th century spiritualist who wrote this amazingly gorgeous treatise called Heavenly Bridegrooms. And it is the documentation of her relationship with her spirit spouse named Soph, S-O-P-H. And Soph was, she referred to him as an angel, but he actually, I interviewed her biographer, and Soph was actually the spirit, he was an ancestral spirit, he was the spirit of a deceased man that she knew growing up who had passed away, and he came back to her, and they began this relation. After he'd passed, he came back to her in spirit form, and they began this erotic relationship, and eventually were married. And she was an amazing woman. She was one of the first sex advocates for women's embodied erotic spirituality. She wrote and disseminated lots of literature on this topic and other topics about radical ideas like women should enjoy sex and should be able to like choose when they have sex, like they shouldn't be forced into having sex with their husbands just because that's what the husband wants. And her story, I encourage you to look her up, read the biography, Heavenly Bridegrooms. It's an excellent, it's written by Veer Chappell, C-H-A-P-E-L-L, I believe, who I interviewed as part of a secondary research for this. So she really inspired me, and her story, or her writing, Heavenly Bridegrooms, is an account of spirit marriage through history, and that got me really excited because she was referring to the same Genesis accounts and also tracking it transculturally. Now, she was not a recognized academic. She was in a time where she tried very hard to get into academic institutions, and because she was a woman, she was refused admission. And so most of this stuff was her own tenacious research. But this whole, I devoted my dissertation to her because hers is actually a really sad story. I feel like this work is in one small part a reclamation and a reconstitution of Ida, because she was definitely a holy woman and was later sainted by the OTO as one of their patron saints. So she talked a lot about sex magic and some of the things that we'll unpack as we get into this. So I found Ida. I was really excited about Ida. And I spent many years, from 2002 to 2009, just researching literature on this. And then finally I had a dream. One of those visitation dreams. And in the dream, I was guided to go back and to do a doctoral dissertation and to undertake this research in a formal container. And the reason that this needed to be done as an academic piece was that I needed a cauldron. I needed a womb space that had really well-defined pedagogy, really well-defined container, so that I could completely be dismantled and transformed by this inquiry, because that I was not only just researching this because I thought it was a cool subject, I was researching this because that I had a contact that was wanting to marry me, and I had no clue who that contact was. So, synchronistically, in 2009, I had this dream to go back and do a PhD dissertation at the same time that I came to Pantheacon and met Orion Foxworth. So for those of you who are not initiated into the mysteries of Orion, he is a British traditional witch and a Celtic fairy seer. And he is married in a co-creative relationship to Bree, who is a powerful, chthonic fairy being and a queen, a fairy queen. And I had a friend at the time, a ceremonial magician, who knew what I was going through, and he was like, I think you should go to Orion's talk at Pantheacon. I think that would be really good for you. And I was like, oh, okay. So I went to Orion. I don't remember at the time what he was talking about, but when I heard his voice, the way I describe it is my spirit leapt. I knew this was my teacher. And so I began in 2009, in the fall of 2009, I began my PhD dissertation to research this, and I began to apprentice to Orion. And I'm now one of his senior apprentices in the House of Bree, Fairy Seership Institute. And because I was a woman on a mission at my PhD program, which is CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies, I took all the classes with this topic in mind, and I pretty much crafted my experience there to focus on this one inquiry. And when I got to the phase of actually writing the dissertation, I chose to take an approach that's called organic inquiry, and it's in the qualitative department. So I was less interested in all the historical information, although I think that was important. I think that's important, but I was more interested in the lived experience of contemporary practitioners of spirit marriage, because I knew, because I'd found Orion and started finding other people, that this is a living practice. This did not die back in ancient Mesopotamia or in the early Hebraic tradition. This was a living practice that I was finding increasing amounts of evidence for in contemporary practice. And I was like, so I'm being invited into this. There's other people that are doing this. What's it all about? What's it for? So I looked at, for my formal research, I looked at 5 specific areas. I looked at the history of spirit marriage in anthropological and historical literature, tracing it through the Mesopotamian sacred marriage, the Hieros Gamos, the Mircea Eliade's accounts of the Siberian Ayami encounters. I looked at British familiar spirits, the book on Mama Lola, the Haitian Vodou practitioner. I traced it through the Nepalese Nawari and the Indian Devadasi. And all of these, and more. But all of these are anthropological and historical literature that have either practiced or continue to practice a form of spirit marriage. I then looked at its accounts in folklore and mythology. And by the way, looking at these different kinds of literature is a little unorthodox. Normally you just look at the anthropological, the historical, the academic stuff, and I was like, we can't just find spirit marriage in academic texts. In fact, the objectification of this through the lens of the sociologist or the anthropologist necessitates a kind of not knowing. One of my interviewees made this great, he's we'll talk about him in a little bit, Henri. He is a Haitian Vodou practitioner. He's also a sociologist. And he had this great quote that he said, when the anthropologist shows up, the spirits leave. So it was incumbent upon me to approach this not just as an external observer, but from the interiority of this practice, meaning that I needed to become a practitioner and a scholar of this, and I needed to engage with the material in an embodied and a transformative kind of way. So I was like, I'm going to also look at folklore and mythologies, because those are the stories that are the collection of stories that hold the repository of this tradition. And so I looked at the stories in Greece. I mean, and a lot of those were actually one of the Greek stories that's fantastic is King Numa was married to a spirit deity who he was one of the early founders of Rome, I believe it was, and he had this spirit wife who essentially helped him write the first laws of Roman rule. And I looked at India and China. I looked at all the stories in the Celtic Isles. I looked at religious literature and practice, the Enochian texts of the Nephilim and the Grigori, the Christian Beguine movement, which is fascinating because all of their writing is very erotic and very much about like falling in love with lady love. It's very, it's also very homoerotic, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The queerness or the non-binariness of spirit, marriage and spirit contexts. Saint Teresa of Avila, where she's, if you know that Bernini statue, where she's in the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, and she's got this angel that's coming into writing around us, describing her being penetrated by this angel's, so it's this these very erotic, and then the tantric deity yoga traditions, where this is a much more encoded practice. And then I looked at the esoteric and occult literature traditions, Idocratic, as I've mentioned, the Fiona MacLeod, William Sharp constellation. Dion Fortune wrote about it, and then contemporary authors Orion Foxwood, Donald Tyson. And then I looked just to help my scholarly audience understand that I was not off on a wild tangent. I was here's some transpersonal psycho-spiritual teachers that are well respected in the psychological community that actually may not have had spirit in marriages, but attribute a tremendous amount of their teachings, in fact most of their core teachings, to non-ordinary or other extraordinary entities. And those are Carl Jung and his relationship with Philemon, and Rudolf Steiner and the Masters. So we sort of set the precedence. This is not something that we're making up. This is not something that is new. This is something that has tremendous provenance and is still being practiced. So from that, From that, I went to collect these people, these current practitioners of spirit marriage. And I had Orion. I had already asked Orion if he would participate in my research study, and he said yes. And then I went into meditation. So organic inquiry, the methodology that I chose, is a methodology that's rooted in qualitative research and narrative and phenomenological inquiry. And what all that means is stories and embodied experience. And the organic inquiry lens is that you're not just doing this from an objective space. You're doing this to be transformed by the research, and to transform others by the research, and to transform your participants, your co-researchers, by the research. And you do this by treating your research topic as if it were an intelligence, as if it were an entity. And you invoke that entity, and you ritualize the research process. So there were certain research rituals that I did before I sat down to do my research, and I spoke and I addressed my research topic as if it were an entity. And I have this sneaking suspicion that the research topic entity and my spirit contact entity might maybe kind of be either the same or embedded in a cluster of intelligences that were guiding this research. So it's research as if it were a sacred process. So steeping in that, I sort of sent my spidey sense out and invited the beings that wanted to be part of this research, because I knew that I would not just be interviewing humans. I would be interviewing humans, and I would be interviewing their spirit spouses as well. And so I knew that if I could just get the spirit spouses on board, they'd bring the humans to me. And that's how it manifested. I mean, I did the formal research, sending it out, yada, yada. But all of my contacts came through synchronicity. Orion came to me because of this relationship we'd been developing. I interviewed, so he's in the Celtic witchcraft, fairy seer community. I interviewed a Shakta Tantric who's married to the goddess Kali. And you're going to hear all their stories in a second here. I interviewed a woman who is a Tingan Sob in the West African Dagara community, Malindoma Some's work. I interviewed a witch and Sandra Ingerman's lineage of shamanic practitioner. Her name is Caroline Kenner. And a couple of my interviewees were like, yeah, you can totally use our name and go on record. And then everybody else I've given pseudonyms to. So Caroline is, she's sort of an eclectic pagan, and she's married to actually a lot of different spirits. So that's a really interesting, and she was sort of my outlier of like, because she'd married and divorced spirits, which you'll hear in a second is not usually done. But you know, Caroline's around. I interviewed, so I had sort of that cluster coming in, but I knew I needed to interview people in the Haitian or the New Orleans Vodou tradition, because that was one of the first traditions that I found that readily married and practiced spirit marriage, or what they call the mariage loa. Very, very, almost kind of commonplace. It's a very common and widely recognized activity in those communities. But I didn't have entree into those groups. And so I was like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. How am I going to find? I live in San Francisco, and most of that community is in Brooklyn or New Orleans, and I don't really know. And so I was pondering, and then I had a dream. And in my dream, I was in New Orleans, and old, beautiful Creole woman showed up, all dressed in white, and she had sunglasses on, and she spoke in this nasally voice, and she said, I want you to come to New Orleans, and I want you to interview me. And I was like, okay, New Orleans. I know it's New Orleans, so okay. And fortunately, at the time, Orion was involved with a festival, the traditional folk magic festival, which was going on in New Orleans. And so I knew he knew people down there. So I was like, okay, I'm going to reach out to Orion and a few other people, the people that were putting this festival on, tell them about my dream and see if they know anybody. And so that ended up opening the roads, and I ended up actually having to do some rituals for the spirits, for the Loa, for the Gede, to help open the roads for those interviews. And if it didn't just bring me one interviewee, I ended up with 4. So from going from 0 to 4, I ended up interviewing New Orleans, a woman who's initiated into both Haitian and New Orleans Vodou, and she is a mambo in New Orleans. And then I ended up interviewing 3 other Haitian Vodou practitioners, 1 in New Orleans and 2 in Brooklyn. So this was like I had like 9 people at this point, and I was like, this is a good sample. This is a good study. So I sat down and asked them questions. I came up with a list. I had like 17 questions that I was going to ask them. And these are sort of the summary of those questions. The guiding question was, how do contemporary practitioners of spirit marriage experience their reported relationship with an otherworldly being? And then the questions that I asked them that are kind of concatenated into these 3 are, what is your experience of spirit marriage? What was your initial calling, your initiation, and what are your current practices? Number 2, how is it currently being experienced or practiced in your life and tradition? And number 3, what is the purpose or the end goal of your marriage? So, setting the stage. Let's meet Orion. Orion Foxwood, I'm going to read a little bit to you about Celtic traditional witch and fairy seer Orion Foxwood is married to a fairy queen, Bree, in the old craft fairy faith tradition of the fairy marriage. Fairy seership is an eco-spiritual practice rooted in the indigenous lineages of Celtic witchcraft and the fairy faith, which was handed down primarily as a secret tradition through families. In Orion's tradition, the fairy people are not diminutive nature elementals, pixies with wings, but profound primordial beings that give rise to life on Earth. Orion describes his fairy wife, Bree, thusly. This particular stream, I always want to do this in a southern accent. Open the whale. Orion is from West Virginia. Yeah. This particular stream, this extension of primal light and primal movement, extended itself into the place we now think of as Earth's orbit. And Bree came with that stream. She is as old as the planet, but older than its form. She is as old as its stellar nature. That companionship to bring that is her origin. That is where she comes from. We are married in a co-creative, coexistent companionship to bring about certain things in this world. It is our hope to inspire other co-creative relationships. In fact, that's what's going to save our planet. I'm going to say that again. This spirit marriage technology is what is going to save our planet. It's a bold claim, but I believe it. It's going to save our species, and it's going to help us avoid extinction. And this was not just him that made this comment. This was actually a theme that many of my co-researchers talked about. So the prime directive of their relationship is service to this planet and to all its life, human and other. His relationship is meant to re-engage humanity with its sacred relationship to life. The impetus behind Bree and Orion's union is to help human beings integrate themselves with their threefold nature: the underworld nature, the universal nature, and the expressed or embodied nature, bringing all three levels into one stream of life. Integration, co-creation, and restoration are the three primary directives of their work. Orion and Bree's mission is to train people in this kind of work so that they, in turn, can show others how to move into sacred relationship with what Orion calls the invisibles, the denizens of the other dimensions of this world, which are vital to its life processes. Orion believes that when this happens, humanity will arrive at a tipping point, and the awakening of global consciousness will be at hand. Orion's work teaches us that humanity is meant to be the custodian or guardian of life here, as well as an innovator on behalf of Earth. He believes that his fairy wife, Bree, and spirit people like her stand ready to help midwife us back into ourselves again. So, a little bit about Orion's marriage and how it came to pass. Orion was raised in the conjure tradition up in Appalachia, and from a very early age, contact with spirits was a sort of a normal de rigueur for him. And he met cunning people from Britain when he was, I think, in his early 20s, and they initiated him into British traditional witchcraft, and then he took a number of different initiations in the British traditional witch lineages. And then he was, I believe it was around the time he started studying with R.J. Stewart, that he started having this contact. And he said that he thought at first it was just this really powerful earth spirit, this fairy being, Bree. And so he was having this contact with this, and he's like, but I'm a witch, and so that's, common to, this is not uncommon for us to have these strong elemental forces. But it was around that time that he and Foxwood Coven were living at Moonridge on a piece of land. And they'd done a tremendous amount of reclamation work with the land. It had been horribly strip-mined, and they were cleaning that up, and they were bringing the spirits back alive on the land there. And Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki came to visit him at Moonridge. And she was in meditation, I think in one of the temples or in her room. And he said she came out, and he said her face was white as a ghost, and she was shaking and trembling. And she said, Orion, I just had an encounter with Bree. And she said, she loves you so much. Why haven't you married her? And Orion said his eyes got wide, and he was like, it was a little bit like a shotgun wedding. And Orion's a gay man, so like marrying a female is not necessarily in his orbit. And so he said, he sort of stuttered. He's like, I don't know. Can I do that? I mean, he said he knew about the traditional fairy marriage and the Celtic lore, but, and so Dolores said, you have to marry her. And so while she was there, and I'm not sure if it was that same or if she came back and did it, but they gathered his coven together, and they performed a marriage rite. And in the traditional fairy marriage, there is a stand-in for the spirit that is being married. And it's usually, and this is where some of the old vestiges of our very heteronormative programming, I think, is kind of caught up in what we think of when we think of marriage, and where we're evolving as a species and as a practice into more of a non-binary place. But in the traditional fairy marriage, you married your opposite of whatever your gender identity was. And so, so Dolores, Orion being identified as gendered as male, Dolores would be his stand-in for Bree, who's the fairy wife. And so they went through this ceremony where they exchanged vows, and normally you exchange rings, but in place of a ring, Dolores gave Orion like one strand of her hair that he like wound around his finger, and he said he didn't really sort of know exactly what he was getting into. He was like, okay. But he said that when Bree gave her, so he said my vows were kind of paltry. And he said when Bree indwelled Dolores, and traditionally in the fairy marriage, the marriage rite is done with the proxy is somebody who's already indwelled by powerful spirits. So the marriage and indwelling are kind of in the fairy tradition seen as sort of the same thing. So Dolores stood as proxy for Bree, and she delivered these beautiful vows that were like, I will love you until the end of the sun and the moon and the stars, and just this vast promise of fealty. And so, and then it was done, and he had to figure out how to, like, make that work. He was in a relationship at the time, and it really disrupted his relationship. And not that Bree meant to do that, but his partner at the time had a hard time sharing him with this new powerful spirit wife. And he also said that he had to entirely be remade. His body, physically, and his nervous system had to be entirely remade. He said that when she began, and that these fairy beings, when they start drawing close to us and wooing us into relationship, we have to go through a recalibration process in our nervous system. And he said, he was kind of given two options for that process. He could be rewired, or he could experience a house fire. And he said, unfortunately, because he's a little stubborn sometimes, he kind of experienced both. But she really transformed his life. His job changed, where he lived changed, his relationship changed, just everything in his life that he was previously attached to, he said, had to be undocked, or had to be taken away, so that she could come and fill with like the Orion 2.0. It's like he was Orion 1.0, he needed to become Orion 2.0. And he said that, any resistance, one of the other things, and this was a common theme as well, is that there were prohibitions. There were things that he could not do or could not ingest, like coffee. So coffee was something that he had to stop drinking for about 7 years. And he talks about 7 as being a really significant, it's the tain or the tithe to hell, which he says is misunderstood. But it's these geasa, or these prohibitions that are put on us, so that and Bree told him the coffee interferes with our calibration process. It does something to your nervous system that makes it harder for me to merge with you and indwell in you. And so there were certain things I think he had to take out sugar for a while, certain things that like disrupted his nervous system that had to and then eventually he's a coffeeaholic again. So let's move on. The Shakta Tantric. So Kama Devi is an anthropologist and a scholar of indigenous women's spiritual traditions in northern India and Nepal. She's also holds a PhD and is a Fulbright scholar. She's a Shakta Tantra practitioner and is a spiritual teacher married to the goddess Kali. Kama elaborates on her relationship with Kali thusly. I'm thinking of all the practitioners that I know and of how Kali came to each of them in a flash, wild, uncontrollable, fierce, penetrating, and unremitting. She has been known to come on as a lightning bolt, loud, bold, and crackling on a clear day, taking us to our knees. We then have to learn to make room for her in our lives, in our bodies, and eventually we learn to fall in love. There's no straightforward way that this happens, nor a clear path. Kama believes that the purpose of her marriage to Kali is to help women learn how to cultivate embodied spirituality in a female body. Kama is herself here to wake up in her female body and to help her students do the same. Kama reports that Kali's agenda is that nobody is left behind, and this also means just as you are. Meeting people where they are is an important aspect of Kama and Kali's marriage. Radical inclusivity, self-acceptance, and sovereignty are paramount to their relationship and teachings. The fact that Kali chose to marry a highly educated white woman with a Western worldview is also an important aspect of their union. According to Kama, Tantric teachings are on decline in the East due to two main factors: the usurpation of the temples by the government and the refusal of the young people to carry on their parents' lineage. Kali chose a wife that would take her message beyond India and make it available to a larger audience. An important element of Kama's work is making Kali's rituals and teachings accessible to Westerners, while at the same time preserving the lineage and the tradition of her teachers. So this is another example of Kama is in India and Nepal, northern India and Nepal, doing dissertation research, going to all these temples, and she had a Sakya, a friend that was taking her to all these temples, but her friend was convinced that Kama wasn't actually there to do dissertation research. She was there to find her Ishta Devi. She was there, and the Ishta Devi is it literally means the chosen deity, or one's deity that one is in deep devotional relationship with, and that sometimes one embodies in deity yoga practices. And so she was taking Kama to all these different temples, hundreds and hundreds of temples, all throughout, just hoping that she would find her Ishta Devi. She said that on one day they'd been going to all these temples, and they went to Ganapati, they went to a Ganesha temple, and she said that she was making the offering to Ganesha, and she felt this energy come from Ganesh, and she said it was like melting butter. It was just this softening. And her friend looked at her and she was like, "What just happened there?" And she said, "I just felt this softening." And her friend was like, "Good, Ganesh is going to open the way." Mm-hmm. And she said that a few days later, they went to a Kali temple. And they were there, I think it was, she said it was on a Tuesday, which is one of Kali's days. And they were, the priests of the temple were making sacrifices. And she went off, and I won't go into all of it now, but there's a whole way in which animal sacrifice is done in India that is sacred and holy, respects the sovereignty of the animal, and really is done in a highly ethical way, way more ethical than anything that we get out of our slaughterhouses here in the West. Mm-hmm. And so they were at the temple, and there was this goat coming up to be sacrificed, and the person had brought the goat. It was, represents a tremendous sacrifice for them to offer this animal financially. And the goat was refusing the sacrifice, and they asked the animal, the animal has to behave in a certain way for them to move forward, and it did not want to be sacrificed. So there was this sort of like confusion. Okay, well, and they let the goat go, and the next animal came up, and she said that they were not far away from the sacrifice. They were like from maybe me to like halfway in the middle of the room. But they were sort of watching it a little bit from afar. And the next animal that came up, when they sacrificed the goat, the Shakti, or the energy that came out of the goat as the blood was spilling, she said, came at her full force, hit her in the chest, and knocked her to her knees. This is a common, I forgot to mention this, but during the Orion Bree union, the ritual, when Bree came in, she knocked everybody in the room to their knees when her energy came in. So this is not an uncommon kind of thing when these spirits step in like this. Knocked Kama to her knees, and her friend was like, "Are you okay?" And she was like, I don't know, like, this is kind of weird. And she said the next day she could feel this presence, this energy inside of her. And she said, I decided I thought, well, I'll just ask it what it is. And she said that the presence said, "I'm Kali." And Kama was like, "Well, I kind of didn't really invite you in. I don't know if I really want you in me. I don't, like, Kali is not." She's like, "She's not the deity I would have chosen." She's fierce and kind of can be intimidating and a little scary and uncompromising, and like she's not like a Parvati or some of these other like goddesses that are a little more easy to flow with. So anyway, Kali's like, "No, I'm not leaving." So she a few days later, there was a famous practitioner, a depossession practitioner, who was going around and doing rituals, and she decided to go to this practitioner. I think she called them a sorcerer, but I'm not entirely sure what the word was she used right now. And this medicine person was doing all sorts of different healings and stuff for the people in the community. And she went up and she told the practitioner what had happened. And the practitioner was like, "So let me get this straight. You've been possessed by Kali. She says she doesn't want to leave, and you want me to go in and remove her?" She was like, "Sorry, not going to do that." And so she said that was the sort of the beginning of their relationship. And she said that was 25, 30 years ago, and there was nothing in the West here. She came back from her research trip, and there was nothing in the West here on Kali. And so she said she sort of had to fumble through her first sadhana, or spiritual practice with Kali. She found a little murti, a little statue, and set it up and just tried to figure out how to do this. And subsequent trips later, she would find her lineage family, and a betrothal and a wedding process would happen. But it was very signs and wonders, and it was very much her feeling her way through and trying to make sense of this relationship that she did not have a ton of support around. So I think, yes, we have agency, but again, almost in all of these cases, the spirits chose the person, and you kind of refuse at your own peril.
Yeah.
Depending on the deity, depending on the spirit. Well, when we talk about Caroline in a second, you'll find that we have a lot more agency. But Kali is not somebody you want to say no to.
No.
So Madrone. Madrone is a West African shrine keeper called a Tingansob, which is a priestess in the West Coast village of the West African Dagara tradition, which was brought to the Bay Area by Malando Masome. Madrone is married to Tingan, the masculine energy of earth, which physically expresses itself through a redwood tree. In the Dagara culture, when a community or village is being developed, the installation of a Tingan shrine is required. To install a Tingan shrine, the Tingan Sob, which is, Sob means job, the priest or priestess who will marry Tingan and serve the community as his intermediary must be appointed. The Tingan tree represents the vertical axis around which the community can revolve, that which connects the community to the masculine energy of Earth as Father and complements Timbalu, the horizontal axis, who's the feminine energy of Earth as Mother. Madrone explains how her relationship with Tingan manifested. I was actually presented with the invitation to become a Tingan Sob and told that it would require marrying Tingan. One of the first things I needed to do is to go choose a tree. But that doesn't just make it a Tingan if you choose a tree. You have to have the actual marriage that brings the tree spirit alive and that brings the Tingan spirit alive in that particular tree. So all Tingan Sobs are interacting with the same energy, but it's a different physical entity that demarks a certain community. In Dagara land, every community would have their own Tingan. That's the vertical axis. It doesn't become a Tingan tribe until the actual marriage ceremony happens. So the purpose of Madrone's marriage to Tingan was first and foremost to serve her community. Community members go to Tingan to be registered as part of the community when a baby is born, or when there's problems in their life that seem to be repeating. And Madrone acts as then the go-between between the community and Tingan. Dagara spirituality is designed to work best in the context of relationships. And Madrone reports that Tingan requires a community and a community requires Tingan. Tingan plays an important role in the Bay Area Dagara community as the entity that is there to help the community work through their somatic experience of scarcity. Madrone says that Tingan has given her a sheath of protection, a sense of belonging, and a ground to surrender to, a stability that she shares with her community as their Tingan Sob. So the interesting thing about their wedding is that her husband, Madrone's husband, is an elder in the Dagara community, and he actually needed to go through certain initiations and set up certain shrines that he could not do until a Tingan shrine was established. And so her husband was sitting with Maladoma, and they were talking about who's going to be this Tingan Sob. And Madrone had a long relationship with trees. She said she wrote a contract when she was young that said, I work on your behalf, to the trees. So she said, I work on your behalf. And so Maladoma was like, oh, you know who the Tingan Sob is, it's your wife. And so she was asked to step into this role and take on this spirit marriage. Now, her husband was also married to some other spirits within the Dagara cosmology. And so then they had to sort of begin this relationship with their human relationship and then their spirit relationships, which were, which is an art, it's a dance. And she says that one of the things that she required was that she not be an intermediary to Tingan on behalf of her husband. She was an intermediary for the rest of the community, but she said one of the requirements was that my husband be able to go to Tingan directly, because I didn't want that to sort of muddy my relationship with him. He needed to be able to access that spirit directly. So, the Washington Witch, Caroline Kenner. Caroline Kenner is a Washington, D.C. based shamanic practitioner, witch, and pagan. She's married to multiple deities across a variety of pantheons, including Egyptian god Anubis, the Santeria Orisha Ogun, the Haitian Vodou Loa Papa Legba, and the Norse god Odin, and others. Our interview focused on her relationship with Odin, who's connected to Caroline through her Northern European ancestors. Caroline describes her first encounter with Odin. I woke up very suddenly in the middle of the night, and I thought there was an intruder in the room because the energy of his manifestation was so palpable. I looked over, and he was standing right by the altar. I could tell it was Odin because he was holding the staff, and he had both of the ravens on his shoulders, and he was just looking at me, and it was very, very intense. Communicating the idea that humans can be healed and empowered by the spirits is part of the larger purpose of Caroline's marriage to Odin. According to Caroline, one of the challenges we face in reviving pagan practices is that because pagan deities haven't been worshipped in a long time, their connection to the mortal world has become somewhat tenuous. Caroline says that once worship of the old gods and goddesses resumes on a wider scale, our ability to receive their blessings will once again flow more freely. Caroline holds that a practitioner's genetic ties to a particular pantheon can help strengthen his or her connection to a deity and amplify ritual. However, she stresses that the worship of the god and goddesses is not and should not be limited to strictly genetic affinity. Although an ancestral tie makes it easier to reach a certain pantheon, it by no means is a requirement. Caroline's spirit marriages have proven to her again and again that the gods care about the fate of humanity. She believes that our ability to communicate with them through evolving our psychic gifts is essential to our survival as a species. She states emphatically, that's why it's so important what we're doing. The stakes couldn't be higher. It's the survival of humanity. Here's what I've been told for the past 25 years, and this is really depressing, but it's what they say. They say there's going to be a tremendous contraction of the human population, and the humans will regard that as Ragnarok. But I've seen what happens. It's geologic, and it's not anytime soon. This is what they told me. This is really important. This is what Odin says. The ability to be psychic will be just as determinative of who goes forward in evolution as the ability to speak was when the species began. The fact that Caroline holds a variety of spirit marriages means that her psychic development is informed by many different traditions. Caroline is devoted to using her gifts to help others develop their own psychic abilities so that they can communicate with the spirit realms as well. One of the most important insights to come out of her conversation is how Caroline's multi-marriages experience illustrates that there is no final say as to how exactly spirit marriages can or must be conducted. So one of the stories Caroline shared with me was that, and most of her marriages happened in a dream. So she was in a dream or in a visionary state, and the spirit would show up and marry her kind of right there on the spot without much negotiation or without much fanfare. And that has seemed to work out fine for her, although with Odin, he pursued her for 20 some odd years, and she kept telling him, no, I don't want to marry you. I don't want to marry you, you're too bossy, you're difficult, I don't want to marry you. And he just pursued her until she was having a really intense health crisis, and she finally agreed to marry him, and then he actually came in because she has a genetic affinity to the Norse gods, to the people that serve the Norse gods. He was able to actually come in and do some healing work on her and for her that helped clear up a lot of the health issues she was having. But she talks about one of the spirits that she was married to, a version of an Elegua, who the marriage happened, sort of spontaneously, and she was not enjoying the relationship. She found the spirit to be really demanding and not vitalizing her. And so she divorced him. She sort of went for her group of spirits and was like, I don't want to be married to this spirit anymore. And so that's the one story I've heard of someone having the ability, and yet, her marriage rites were different than some of these other community witness rites where a different kind of indwelling is happening.
Was she talking about Odin? Did she no longer want to be married to?
No, it was a different spirit. She said it was a version of an Elegua. I believe. I don't have the name written down here, but yeah, that's correct. Thank you. All right, let's talk about, the New Orleans Voodoo Mambo. So Suzette is a New Orleans Voodoo Mambo, or priestess, who is also initiated into Haitian Vodou. Suzette has a deep connection to the afterlife and all the various spirits associated with it. She reports regularly seeing ghosts of both humans and animals. Suzette is married to the Voodoo Loa Baron Samedi, who rules over the dead. She describes how the Baron proposed to her. In voodoo ceremonies, normally what you strive for is that one of the Loa, the spirits, possesses a person. It makes it able for you to communicate, ask advice or insight, and help you with a problem. Baron Samedi would pop out, and he would always find me right away. He would pick me up and throw me in the air, and he would hug me. And in Baron Samedi's case, he never really asked anybody to marry him. But one night, he did ask me to marry him. And he wanted the ceremony to be on Day of the Dead, November 1st, which is their day. He described exactly what I had to wear. He described an outfit I had hanging in my closet for 10 years that one that I'd never worn to voodoo ceremonies, and he described it to a T. Suzette reports that her ability to see, hear, and communicate with the deceased have all been amplified since her marriage to the Baron. The Baron is a protector and provider for Suzette, offering guidance and support in many of the ways a human partner would. Suzette emphasizes that when you are in a spirit marriage, you are in a relationship with someone. You are married to a person, a consciousness, except they are not in a physical body. She explains that you cultivate a relationship with your spirit spouse just like you would a relationship with a physical spouse. They have your back. They watch out for you. And the Voodoo Loa are famously helpful intercessors in their devotees' lives. Suzette feels that she's become more of who she truly is as a result of her relationship with Baron Samedi. Her spirit marriage has empowered her, expanding and enhancing her consciousness and spiritual growth. The Baron has also helped her recover from an abusive relationship and infused her with an audacity of spirit. Suzette now serves as a guide in Mambo, helping to demystify and normalize the oftentimes daunting world of the afterlife for others. Her work also helps to bring healing to the ancestors by listening to what they need and helping them settle their affairs. Her spirit marriage teaches her to listen to the voices of the dead, look for opportunities to serve and heal, and ultimately teach others to stand in agency and sovereignty to do the same. Suzette's marriage to Baron Samedi has made her an empowered, independent woman and a sensitive and effective Mambo. So the New Orleans Voodoo protocol for the Mariage Loa and the Haitian Vodou protocol is that the spirit will propose marriage, usually through a divination, like your Ungan or Mambo will divine that the marriage needs to happen. Sometimes they'll propose it to you as Baron Samedi, and then you go through very much like a human marriage. You bake a cake, you get a dress or suit, you get rings, and you have a community witnessed marriage ceremony to the spirit that you are then expected to set aside one night a week to one night a month, or a couple of nights a week sometimes, depending on what their days are. They have days that are sacred to them. And you don't sleep, you sleep alone, and you have a encounter as you sleep with your Loa, and they visit in dreams and visitations, and sometimes there's erotic encounters, and sometimes there is just advice in your visiting with the spouse. So let's talk really quickly. The Haitian Vodou practitioners that I interviewed were Henri, and he is a sociology professor who is married to an ancestor, Maya Darren, who was a documentary filmmaker, and he's also married to the Erzuli Dantor and Erzuli Freda, and he's also a gay man. And so we talked a little bit about what's it like to be a gay man married to these female ancestors, and he's like, well, I don't know. I mean, he didn't really think much about it. Honestly, he thought that these women were his muses in a lot of ways. He's a writer, and he was a documentary filmmaker at one point as well, which is when Maya started coming to him. And so he talks about his spirit wives helping him in his teaching and helping him. He writes about the gay Southern men's experience and all these different things that they sort of inspire and work with him on co-creative projects for his community. And then the final two practitioners that I interviewed are a mother-daughter hereditary Mambos from Haiti. The daughter, Monique, is married to a constellation of deities, but she told me this wonderful story about her marriage to, or about her relationship with Papa Legba, because she's a hereditary Mambo. Her grandmother and her mother are both Mambos. When she was born, her mother and her grandmother were in the delivery room, and as she was coming out, her grandmother pushed the OBGYN out of the way. And what I should say is Papa Legba rose up in her grandmother, pushed the OBGYN out of the way, caught the baby and said, "It's my wife! My wife is here!" Yeah, Monique is like, I'm so embarrassed every time I hear that story. Like, the poor nurses and doctors in that room. But in her case, she had married him by the age of 13, her early teens, and went on to marry a variety of different spirits in that lineage. And she is also married to Ungan, to a priest in that, and he's got his constellation of deities. So if you can imagine, they're married, they've got their deities, and they're supposed to set aside a couple of nights a week by themselves to just be with their deities. They were like, that's not going to work. So she said we all had to sort of sit down and had like a family meeting with the spirits and negotiate how it was going to work so that my husband and I could actually sleep together and make the spirits happy. So, and they figured it out. I think they set aside one night a month or something like that for each of their different spirits, and they've worked it out. But I thought that was a beautiful illustration of how much agency and negotiation we can ask and require of the spirits. And then her mother, Nanette, is married also to a collection of spirits, and Dambala, who is a snake god, wanted to marry her, and she's deathly afraid of snakes. And she was like, "Oh, I do not, like, I don't know how to do this." And so she negotiated with the spirit and was like, all right, if you never appear to me as a snake, then I'm okay with marrying you. And so that's their agreement, is he never appears to her. He appears to her as this beautiful man, and she's happy to see him. And she wears his, so that, part of this is the jewelry that they wear for the different spirits. And so she said, she has so many rings at this point that she devotes like a month, and so I think she said March was Dambala's month, so she'll wear his jewelry throughout the month of March, and then she'll move on to another spouse the next month, and et cetera, and that's how she works her way around her different betrothals. Finally, I interviewed a Hermetic magician. This is a little bit of an outlier. This is a high-level initiate in the Golden Dawn. I had this feeling, though, that the knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel, which is a practice or something that the ceremonial magician seeks to achieve, is not all that different from a spirit marriage. Because even though traditionally one doesn't marry one's HGA, and it isn't necessarily having an erotic relationship with the HGA, it is an indwelling process, and it is a co-creative consciousness that moves down and through and in the human being. And in tantric practice, one actually does work with an erotic relationship with the Ishta Devi, or can. And so I interviewed Frater Lux, who describes, who undertook the Abramelin operation, which is a 3-year ritual, or for him it took 3 years to build up and prepare himself for the contact, which they enter into a 3-day hermetically sealed retreat where one quests for the name and the identity of one's HGA, or Holy Guardian Angel. So this is what he said about his 3-day retreat. I started seeing what I thought at the time was the face of God in the smoke of the incense. It was just unbelievable. Towards the end of the Abramelin ritual, when I thought it was all over, I'd completed the series of rituals I'd laid out, and I'd had some pretty profound experiences. I'd gotten the Holy Guardian Angel name, and I was basically closing the temple, and then the real thing happened. Wham! It was like a reverse Kundalini experience from the top down. It was this top-down cosmic orgasm that literally knocked me to the floor. And I was curled up on the floor in the fetal position, and I had no idea that was going to happen. And I was really not the same after that for a long time. So he said that once he completed this operation and got the name, his feelings of isolation and disconnection completely went away, as did his search for meaning. And it seemed to clear out and reprogram his needs, habits, and desires. Things that he had been heavily invested in before just practically fell away. The other thing was that he asked his Holy Guardian Angel if he had anything, that he wanted him to teach. And he didn't just get one thing, he got like downloads of information that he needed to start bringing out into the world. And so this idea that the holy guardian angel sits above and spirits sit somehow out from us, I think is a little bit of a misnomer. I mean, we sort of orient like that spatially because we're in this physical reality and dimension, but above, below, around, within, and out in a non-ordinary space and state is not all that accurate of a descriptor. So whether we're talking about a holy guardian angel, or whether we're talking about spirits around us, or in the Vodou tradition, they said the Lua ride you, but they don't ride you from the outside in. Actually, it's more accurate to say they come out of you. So these spirits in many ways are embedded or part of our fractalized consciousness as individuals. So I'm going to talk really briefly about the main themes that came out of this. I'm just going to read through these slides. So this was sort of like from all of these stories that I collected. Here's 5 main themes. Number 1, the importance of community. For most of my co-researchers, the spirit marriage needed to become a public relationship, a kind of participatory spirituality involving the entire community. This served to make their relationship real for both the practitioner and the community, a development which held the practitioner to the vows that they took publicly and gave the community a sense of cohesion. So community is really important. We're not doing this in isolated, because it really holds us not only to being witness, but also it holds us in integrity with these practices and with each other. Sovereignty through surrender. Spirit marriage practitioners reported sacrificing, literally making sacred, aspects of their life, work, relationships, personality, or possessions, and in some cases being completely remade via the vehicle of the spirit marriage. Sexuality and divine union. Many co-researchers reported enjoying the deeper unitive experience and activation that a sexual encounter with their spirit spouse provided. Some even reported that the byproduct of an erotic relationship with their spirit spouse was the co-creation of new ideas, teachings, and spiritual systems of study. Making love to a spirit was a way to revitalize the body, making it a temple of divine awakening. Co-creation and conscious evolution. Spirit marriage seems to allow the human counterpart to reach past their finite sense of self and expand to embrace the realms of consciousness beyond the reach of space and time. Many reported that this hastened a kind of evolutionary change in them, enhanced or evidenced by new or increasing extrasensory capabilities and extraordinary phenomena. So this idea of quickening our psychic capacity. And then finally, what I call the process of entheosis, or sometimes apotheosis. Entheosis is any spiritual process that connects an individual to a divine or rarefied aspect of themselves and helps to bring the mundane human consciousness into greater awareness and dialogue with the divine or transpersonal aspect, perhaps even allowing them to embody this consciousness as a way of being in the world. The realization of the divine self, the entheotic state, I argue, is not an unprecedented experience reserved only for an exceptional few, but perhaps the intended birthright of all people on this planet at this time, and very much needed if we're to survive as a species. So a few precautions when we're talking about divines. Self-aggrandizement, right? Your spiritual achievements are nobody else's business. When I went first looking for somebody who had, in the ceremonial tradition, who had achieved knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel, they said, well, if somebody tells you they have, they probably haven't. And if somebody hasn't, or if somebody has, they're not going to tell you. If somebody hasn't, if somebody tells you, you get it.
Yeah.
If they tell you that they've had it, they probably haven't, because nobody is like boasting about these things. Fortunately, I kind of had an inroad with this one practitioner who wanted to remain anonymous. Competition is another precaution or downfall. We either all get there together, as Kama said, or we don't get there at all. It's a radical, inclusive path. Superiority, then, is the third downfall. Everyone has a divine self that's trying to get their attention. We're all just at different places on the road. And remembering that, I think, is really paramount. So a few additional insights, and then I'll tell you about my story, and we'll hopefully have some time for some questions. Because most of the co-researchers are in committed human relationships, in addition to spirit marriages, in most cases a kind of polyamory is being practiced, whether they name it such or not, which is really interesting. The spirits ultimately are not gendered in the way we humans typically understand gender. Gender is a device that spirit uses to inform, enhance, or balance needed qualities within the practitioner. Gender is a language, not a fixed state. Through honoring our relationship to Earth as sacred body and engaging in the art of eco-spiritual practice, humanity becomes a conscious co-creator in Gaia consciousness. And our own bodies become the interface point for this exchange. Waking up, then, is not a transcendent state of escape, but a radical indwelling of the divine within ourselves and our planet. So, my story in 10 minutes or less. Autoethnography of an ecosexual priestess. This is from Orion. The physical body, journey to my divine self. Physical body is not a soul unto itself. It is the living crossroads that mediate the lunar tides of the dreamwalker from below and the stellar powers of the starwalker from above, and bears these forces into the surface world. It is imprinted with powerful ancestral and fairy forces and ancient stellar intelligence. These forces move through your body, in your breath, electrical currents and blood, and are recorded in your flesh and bone. I call these potent forces the gods of the flesh. They lay sleeping in your surface walker until they are intentionally awakened, opened up through trauma, or awakened through other experiences of altered states. The body itself is the temple of ancestral wisdom and the gateway to the path of spiritual truth. So, really briefly, I concomitant with this fairy or this spirit lover contact that I was cultivating, I began to cultivate some divine self practices. And this is a picture of me at a Mary Magdalene service that we did for a number of years up in, or that I was invited to participate in for a number of years up in Marin, where we created the empty tomb, and I sat sort of as the Magdalene. And through my studies of Shakta Tantra and deity yoga, we learned practices for bringing the divine or bringing the deity out in the body. And I got really curious about what would that be like if I just sort of tried to do that all the time and allowed this rarefied aspect to sort of speak through me and move through me, and that was interesting. It was an interesting experiment, and then it also leads to all sorts of well, who the heck am I then if I'm also Megan and I'm also this rarefied aspect of myself? And so there's a negotiation, and my therapist at the time was like, this is all great that you're having all these extraordinary experiences, and you also need to just sometimes be regular Megan and do regular Megan stuff and focus on being a good regular Megan. And I was like, so having somebody that holds us accountable, having a therapist or a coach or somebody who's gone before and can help hold us into accountability and help us navigate this kind of work, I think is really key. Whether that's a community or an individual. But that process of working those technologies, those spiritual technologies, helped do the refinement in addition to the cauldron of the dissertation, then allowed me to step into more of a co-creative relationship with my contact, who I began to understand is situated in the fairy tradition, and who I began to refer to as my fairy beloved. And I began to have increasing dreams and visitations around this being, and as my research came to an end, I finally got the name. It took me 10 years to get the name of the contact, and his cosmological location, and finally, as I was completing the dissertation research, I went through the fairy marriage, which was nothing like I had expected. It was sort of a little bit more like the Caroline Kenner, where I went into trance I was at the Spiral Dance a few years ago, priestessing there, and we do this visioning ritual to the Isle of Avalon, and it was there that the fairy spirit came and married me, and it was just sort of a done deal. And I was like, well, that was really anticlimactic. I mean, like, I didn't even have to get a dress or rings or anything. I didn't prepare any vows, but, you know, they're tricksy that way. And my spirit contacted, because being a fairy, it was just perfect. It was exactly the way it needed to happen. So let's skip to some recommendations, and then I'll take a few questions, and I can stay for a few minutes after, you know, if people want to, because there's nothing coming in after this. So for those of us that feel called into spirit marriage relationships, or are being wooed by a spirit, here are a few recommendations. Devotion, discernment, discipline. Devotion. One must have an unwavering devotion to the great work of embodying the divine self and of entering into human union with the spirit. Discernment. One must cultivate discernment of both external and internal influences on the psyche, so you know who and what is actually talking to you. Discipline. One must cultivate steadfast discipline upon the path. As Frater Lex said, we need to understand, first of all, that we have a divine self that is actionable, and then we have to discipline ourselves and devote ourselves to the process of embodiment of that unwaveringly. So, final thoughts. Reaching out, or perhaps reaching in, to the indwelling of a spirit empowers us to move beyond our previously held beliefs about reality, and it encourages us to look with new eyes at the horizon of possibility. The horizon of possibility. The world around us becomes animated with many varied mysteries just waiting to be touched. We empower the world around us to embody its own mystery, to live out beyond us, out beyond our field of bounded knowing. We make sacred all of existence, from the tiniest atom to the largest tree. We are no longer the center or the master of creation. Instead, we are its beloved, waiting to be wooed by its ardent desire for our embrace. So, I have a practice, what I call normalizing the paranormal. If you are interested in talking about this, your own experiences, whatever, email list. I'm offering free sessions. You can come and set up a little Skype session and talk about your experiences. Just sign up here. You can also go to my website here.